Good evening, this is News.PH, but it's not politics as usual. I'm Pia Hontiveros. Because we all know it cannot be disaster as usual, tonight we talk about disaster and preparedness in the aftermath of Super Typhoon Yolanda and the earthquake in Bohol. We are broadcasting from the University of the Philippines Diliman Engineering Theater, and we thank the UP Student Council for helping us organize this show here in UP Diliman. Our guests, Director Renato Solidum of the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, Oscar Lizardo of Project NOAA, which is under the Department of Science and Technology, Dr. Rosa Perez, a consultant of the Climate Change Commission, and Sabite Lacson-Paguio, DRR Project Manager of Oxfam. DRR, Disaster Risk Reduction Project Manager of Oxfam. What we've assembled here are people we never really want to listen to until it's too late. I'm sorry, I have to say that. But we thank you just the same because you never seem to mind sounding like broken records. So let's begin with this. Oscar and Director Solidum. An earthquake and a typhoon, they're not disasters, right? They are natural hazards. That's correct, Director Solidum?
Yeah, that's correct. These are events that would occur naturally. These would become disasters if people get killed, if there will be significant economic losses, social disruption.
Mm-hmm. And Oscar?
That's right, and this is a good forum for us to differentiate between hazards and disasters. No? As Director Solidum said, there's really a difference. Hazards are naturally occurring, while disasters are a consequence of that hazard whenever we don't handle it well.
Whenever we don't handle it well or prepare for it.
Exactly, thank you.
Okay, natural hazard meaning we really do expect that it will happen. It is something we need to live with, but we just need to prepare for it.
You're correct.
Okay, but as natural hazards, especially when it comes to typhoons, it seems they're getting more frightening. We just had Super Typhoon Yolanda, of course, and it is more frightening here in this country. Why is that so, Dr. Perez? Climate change, global warming?
Well, first of all, we have tropical cyclones every year,
Yes.
20 on the average.
We are so used to them, right?
We are so used to them. So something that is beyond the average, the conditions, is we are not prepared. I mean, you can see that happened today, this year. But climate change and global warming has an effect because it can make the intensity and frequency change. But we are just uncertain on the direction. So we have to have more studies and researches on this.
It seems the typhoons are getting so much stronger. I remember when Super Typhoon Yolanda hit land for the first time, there were many meteorologists from all over the world who were on social media, and they were all saying the same thing. This is off the charts.
Yeah, but we have also Super Typhoon Reming in 2009. So it's not something not unusual. I mean, it could be unusual, but it's not impossible to happen.
Okay, but the damage now is so much greater than Reming.
Yeah, because hazard is only one part of the equation. There are still other factors, the vulnerability, the adaptive capacity, etc. So hazard is only one of them.
Vulnerability, interesting term. Sabite, Lacson-Paguio of Oxfam. In earthquakes and in typhoons, in natural hazards, why do we say that it is the poor who are the most vulnerable? Yung mga mahihirap, yun ang pinaka-vulnerable.
Well, first, it's because they have the least capacity, no, to prepare, and then, of course, to bounce back from any occurrence of disaster. So that's why Oxfam usually prioritizes its interventions targeting the poor and the vulnerable people.
When you say they have a harder time preparing, meaning, if we talk about prepare, a 72-hour emergency kit, ang mga mahihirap, hindi ganun kadali para sa kanila
of course,
yun.
Definitely. And of course, information, the resources that they have, no, to be able to prepare for it, they don't have those resources also.
Yung mga bahay nila made of light materials, for
Yes,
example, di naman sila
definitely.
pwede magpa-konkreto, etc.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Yes, Director Solidum.
But in reality, if you talk about earthquakes are actually a hazard that would target different social classes. In Asia, most of the victims will be those who can afford to either have concrete houses or brick houses in South Asia. And these are the classes that are severely affected by a strong earthquake. Those with light materials like bahay kubo or wooden materials are actually survivors of strong earthquake. In fact, in Bohol, you can see houses made up of wood very near the fault that moved. And therefore, one can really look that sometimes it's not simply whether you're poor or you're rich, but whether the building that you stay in is vulnerable to a particular hazard. But for typhoon, then light materials are not so good for strong winds. So it depends on the hazard.
All right. Director Solidum, I wanted to ask you also, when we say preparation, we talked about preparation, we don't just mean, well, nabanggit ko na yung 72-hour emergency kit. No? We talk about, what we mean here is, not just the 72-hour emergency kit, what do we do when an earthquake or a typhoon strikes? We're talking about structures and communities, making them disaster resilient.
Yes.
So kanina sinabi nyo, ang earthquake halimbawa, ang magiging vulnerable dito ay pwedeng middle class or mayaman na nakatira sa isang konkretong bahay na hindi naman sturdy.
Yes.
That is not sturdy.
Correct. Because sometimes people would associate preparedness as simply moving away from a certain location, which is considered a hazard zone. But in essence, if you look at a strong earthquake, like what happened in Bohol, and the strong wind brought in by Super Typhoon Yolanda, it's not simply moving away, but staying inside well-built, earthquake-resistant or resilient and wind-resistant structures. Of course, we need to look at safer location. That's another part of preparedness. But preparedness can also mean what you do before, during, and after. For example, you need to be aware of what can happen in your place and then prepare in advance where do you need to go. Where do you evacuate? Is the structure or building that will be used as an evacuation area will be resistant?
Yeah.
Will be resistant to earthquake, will be resistant to strong wind away from flood.
Yeah, which was not the case in Super Typhoon Yolanda because we had evacuation centers that collapsed themselves.
Yes. And aside from that, we need to have a different way of appreciating the problem. I'm advocating for people to really imagine the disaster, meaning not only imagine the hazard that is coming, but also imagine the effect of the hazard so that when the effect happens, then we can respond to it properly. That is what I call disaster imagination and preparing to respond. When you want to respond to a certain disaster, you need to be able to imagine which will be affected, which will not, and which provinces can help neighboring areas. So it's simply a bayanihan spirit where if one is affected, the others not affected would help, or not severely affected would help. But that can only brought about by imagining the possible disaster. And that is what we are trying to advocate in FIVOX DOST, is to develop scenarios so that we can prepare in advance how to reduce the risk and also how to respond to it when it happens.
Scenario building.
Scenario building.
But it is the local government units that have to do that, right?
Well, in terms of the response, both the local and national should do it. We cannot just let the local government do it. Because we also have to understand the scale of events.
Yes.
There are localized hazards, like landslide, that's very localized. But a super typhoon, a very strong earthquake, a big tsunami, or a large storm surge will not only affect a single area, but can be very wide. No? So therefore, both at the national, regional, and local level, there must be preparedness that is built upon the scenario that everyone is appreciative of.
Well, what I meant was, Director Solidum, when you say disaster imagination, when you're trying to build a scenario, obviously it's the local community
that will have to
respond to that, that will have to imagine what is a disaster going to look like in our community so that we will know what to do. No? But I also know what you're saying. You're saying that, of course, kapag masyadong malawak yung pinsala sa isang area at masyadong malaki yung area, hindi lang local, ang daming mapipinsala. Minsan yung first responder pa ang biktima.
It happened in Ondoy.
Right.
When I received text messages from rescuers to call other rescuers to help them. Okay? Actually, hindi dapat sila nag-text sa akin. Hindi naman ako rescuer. But that was the important message of the time when Ondor was happening. And so similarly, in Yolanda, the responders were not only affected by the storm surge, but also the severe wind. So with that scale, we have to have a response, not only from the local, but even at the regional and national level.
Okay. Dapat pala i-rename ko yung episode, hindi disaster and preparedness, disaster and imagination. Oscar Lizardo of Project NOAA, how can people prepare for a typhoon? Not just emergency survival kit, 72-hour survival kit, and what do you do in terms of a typhoon? How do you make sure your house is strong enough to withstand the wind and the rains?
Siyempre, you must base your decisions on science or, for example, yung building code na isang lugar. No? For one is, kunyari, you intend to purchase a house or build a community in a certain area, you must look at the possible hazards in that area as well. Is it prone to landslides? Is it a typhoon path? And many others. In the case of earthquakes, you must look at the fault maps. You can look at that.
Geohazard maps.
Geohazard maps. And then, you can base your decisions off of there. So if you want to build there, you must make sure that these houses are first resistant to winds. For example, mga 250-kilometer winds, if that's the hazard in that area. Then at the same time, you must put in the factor of safety. So if kung ganito kalakas yung mahangin na dumadaan sa lugar na to, you must make a house that you can withstand 300 kilometer per hour winds, for example.
Wow,
Mga
magkano yun?
Yun,
Kung pang 100 kilometer per hour winds, baka 1 million lang yon. So,
There must be critical or evacuation facilities that people can go. So, siguro nga mahal masyado yung mga bahay na mag-withstand ng mga 300 kilometers per hour. But the essence is, you evacuate them to safer places. Then you rebuild again. But if
Okay.
there is a technology that can be built, can be used to do that, then it will be okay.
yeah, well, the Philippines has so much money anyway, di ba? PDAF, dapat. We can build structures, no, na pwede pang 300 kph winds. But, okay, yung disaster imagination, I wanted to talk more about that, Oscar. We can do that also for typhoons, right? Do you do that for that is what Project NOAA does in a sense.
What essentially we do is, yun nga, in line with disaster imagination, we provide information for example, like mga 3D modeling of floods, no? So it will help you imagine what kind of consequences, let's say, a certain weather disturbance can be. So for example, sinabing ganito karaming ulan, you can already model that kind of flooding, which has an equivalent amount of rainfall. So yun, you can already see based on dun sa geography ng lugar kung hanggang saan yung pagbabaha. And then not only that, so this could be used as a basis for local governments for their land use planning, yung mga zoning nila. So this is information that is useful for not just preparing for disasters, but entirely preventing or mitigating the consequences of that hazard.
All right, we'll have to take a short break first. News.PH will be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to News.PH. I'm Pia Hontiveros. We're talking about disaster and preparedness, or as Director Solidum of FIVOLX was saying, maybe we should, well, I was saying that we should talk about disaster and imagination. It's a very interesting suggestion. So let's change the episode title. Okay, so preparing for a typhoon, preparing for an earthquake. Sabay, Lacson-Paguio, how does Oxfam prepare or help people prepare?
Okay. I would like to link it also with what Director Solidum is saying about disaster and imagination. No? Oxfam, for its disaster risk reduction work, actually is doing risk assessments, no? at the local level together with the communities. We call this the Participatory Capacity and Vulnerability Assessments, or the PCVA. So this now brings into a concept that brings together local government units and the communities themselves to collectively assess what are the risks that surrounds them, the hazards that are present in the area, and imagine how that would affect them. This again will be followed by a process that we call contingency planning. So together with the government and the communities, these analysis that is built by the communities are transformed into institutional instruments that guides the planning process of local government units. And we are doing this in several municipalities and provinces across the country.
Okay, when
Yeah.
you say several municipalities and cities, how many?
Well, we did this in our post-Quetzana or post-Ondoy response covering Laguna and Rizal, the provinces of Laguna and Rizal. And Oxfam has a focus in Mindanao. So we are doing this, for instance, in Surigao del Norte. We are happy to say that our partners in Surigao del Norte, who has also became a track of Yolanda, were able to respond at least, no? They reported no casualties during Yolanda, and they were able to prepare well for that. And I understand there are also initiatives from our partners in Luzon and some more other provinces in Mindanao, especially those areas where we also responded to during emergencies.
Sabit, when you first went to a community, no? For example, Laguna, Rizal, and then Surigao Norte, yung unang punta nyo, when you try to explain, mag-imagine nga tayo ng disaster, anong possible response, etc., no? What was the initial reaction? Was it, hindi mangyayari sa amin yan? Meron pang ganon?
For the case of Laguna and Rizal, we did that because it was after Undoy. So,
Okay.
meron silang pinanggagalingan na karanasan.
Trauma. Okay.
Oo, may karanasan sila. So, I don't think we encountered something like, hindi yan,
Okay.
ano.
But
So,
in your conversations with the people there, no, I'm sure you asked them, so what was it like before Ondoy struck? Did you expect
Yeah.
na ganito ang mangyayari?
Yeah.
Ano yung sinasabi ng mga tao? Because now with Yolanda, when you talk to people in Samar, in Leyte, in Panay Island, many of them will say na akala namin hindi mangyayari sa amin yan.
Yes,
Diba?
yes,
No.
definitely. Yung sa yung for instance when we did our post Quetzana or post Undoy recovery project, no, in Laguna and Rizal, they were highlighting about the fact that it is something that they've experienced before. They have not experienced before. So parang ang message is that parang nagiging pagrabe ng pagrabe yung mga bagyo na ganito yung mga nagiging impact.
Okay, so pagrabe ng pagrabe. Pero iniisip ba nila, pumasok ba sa isip nila na baka sa susunod mas grabe pa? Meron bang ganon?
Definitely.
Or are they in denial na siguro ito na yung huli, parang ganon?
No.
Ano yung sinasabi nila?
They actually expect more than that. That's
Oh,
why.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. Dr. Perez.
I was saying, kagaya doon sa Leyte, the last one na meron silang experience was in 1912. So this Yolanda is 100-year
101.
100-year typhoon. So wala na sigurong buhay doon sa area to have an anecdotal experience shared with the community. So it's very important to have this kind of information in the community, yung historical
Yeah.
yung history ng typhoon in the area. And going back to imagination, we can add maybe scientific imagination, that is building the scenarios using scientific inputs. Like you can already have an atlas of storm surges in the coastal area depending on the strength of the typhoon, yung winds niya, the approach, And the coastal,
Approach? What do you mean by approach?
Yung
Yung pagpasok
landfall
ng
niya.
tubig.
Yeah, kasi not the tubig, the
Direction.
direction of the bagyo.
Okay.
So, importante yon kung mag-generate siya ng mga waves na yung storm surge. And the configuration of the coastal area. So,
Yeah.
pwedeng gawin yan way ahead of time. Kahit walang nangyayari, you can prepare that at last already. And then distribute this to the coastal areas. So, ang ano naman, ang storm surge is only accompanying, yung mga bagyo na malalakas. Yung mga depression at saka
Yeah.
storm, wala yan.
Oh, just medyo digression ng konti, no? Itong storm surge. I remember in the days after Yolanda, there was this mini debate about, hindi naman namin maintindihan yung storm surge eh. Kung sinabi yung tsunami, maintindihan namin yon. There is a difference, right,
Yeah,
ma'am?
of course. Para yan yung mga tao na iba-iba yung pangalan, iba-iba ang parents. So, ang storm surge at saka tsunami, they have the same impact, but they have the different sources.
Sources.
No? Yung generators. So, earthquake yon kay Dr. Solidum yung tsunami, whereas sa Pag-asa yung storm surge.
Storm surge. So a storm surge is caused by a typhoon.
Nagpa-pile
Yeah.
up yung water because of the pressure, low pressure, at saka yung wind, strength
The
of
winds push the waves
Yeah.
onto, well, what happened in Yolanda.
So kung shallow yung coast mo, yung force niya mas malakas and it will enter the vicinities.
Oo. At pag tiningnan nyo yung mapa ng Tacloban, Leyte, Tacloban, Samar.
Flat lang naman yung Leyte.
Funnel, no? Director Solidum. So talagang dun lahat bubuhos.
Yes.
Okay.
So may history siya. Yun yung pinaka-importante.
Okay, so storm surge, again, well, since we're in front of the students, storm surge caused by typhoons and then the tsunami caused by... So, hindi rin tama na sabihin natin na, oy, Pag-asa, dapat ang tawag nyo doon ay tsunami. Kasi mali.
Mali yan.
Yeah. Let me just add to the earlier question on the apparent intensity of typhoons increasing. That's why people are becoming more affected. But let's not forget, the hazard is just one. The effect of community is another thing. And that is based on the exposure, the people, the community, the assets, and what they're doing with the environment. For example, if you talk about the Laguna Lake, in 2007, I talked to, when we were presenting a project that we were doing for the whole Laguna, they were asking me about the volcano. I said, don't worry about the volcano.
The volcano?
Mount Makiling. Mount Makiling. I told them, worry about the lake, the flooding from the lake, because the lake is getting shallower with all the sediments coming from the mountain because of erosion, sediments from the overfeeding of fishes, and waste materials being thrown.
Sir, illustrate it for us. When you say the lake is getting shallower, it is now how deep
It's like
compared
4
to
meters.
before? 4
Yeah,
meters.
it was much
That's so
deeper than
shallow.
before. Yeah, that's so shallow.
Yeah.
Meaning, maybe before it was deeper, then even the large amount of rainwater can still be accommodated. But since it's becoming shallower, then madaling umapaw. And therefore, communities that are well within the flood zone when the water would rise will be flooded. So we should not forget that hazards are just one factor, but how we prepare and how we modify our environment will also matter. And sometimes people would just want to focus on the trigger of the event, but not focus on how we are making ourselves more vulnerable, susceptible to the impact of a
I was
particular
about to ask
disaster.
you, interesting that you use the term modify, and then you said how we make ourselves more vulnerable by how we treat our environment, modify, change our environment. So if, in the case of Laguna Lake, because it's shallower now because of the way we treated Laguna Lake, talagang
It's becoming
maapektuhan
shallower.
tayo.
Maapektuhan tayo. And now, for example, going back to Yolanda, that part where the airport is, Barangay San Jose, is really overpopulated. And the structures there, many are really wooden structures. And they are along the coast. If you're along the coast, you're prone to storm surge and tsunami. And that's the fact. We don't question.
Yeah.
Kasi ganun na talaga ang
Yeah.
lugar nila. And if we put ourselves there and build so many flimsy houses, for sure, we're increasing the vulnerability of the community.
Okay. In other words, if we put ourselves
In
in
danger.
harm's way, harm will come. Let's go back first sandali lang to Sabite, Lawson. Nabanggit ni Director Solidum ang Laguna Lake. Did you also discuss that particular issue with people in Laguna?
Yes, definitely. That was pointed out even by the provincial governments and even the communities, no? Kaso mukha yatang naging hindi natuloy yung project na yan for some reason or another. So, yun yung binabalik-balikan ng mga partners namin. Ganun pa rin ang
Yeah.
nangyayari dito sa Laguna. Hindi nag-move yung project na
Oo,
yun.
but
So,
it's so
every
critical.
time... Yeah.
It's like a disaster waiting to happen. Hindi ba?
Yeah, so may governance really is a big issue. Yes.
Governance, okay.
When we talk about disaster risk reduction, so malaki ang papel ng governance dito.
Okay, so let's move on. One more general question before we take questions from our audience, our live audience. Now the question is, after Yolanda and after the earthquake, the Yolanda in the Visayas and the earthquake in Bohol, should we build back better? Director Solidum.
Definitely. Building back better is not simply putting up structures and putting up settlements in a safer place, but also making sure that the redevelopment of an area would be sustainable in the future. Okay, and putting back better would also mean how people's lives will be improved, and they will be able to really prepare themselves and their families for future disasters, making the community more resilient to natural hazards that may come their way.
Okay, so like earlier you were talking about sturdier homes and more importantly, sturdier evacuation centers. And then, lalo na ngayon, a few weeks ago, di ba ang napag-usapan, Director Solidum, itong scenario of a 7.2 magnitude earthquake here in Metro Manila.
Yeah. Yes, that is one of the ways that we try to help not only the community but the decision makers, the political leaders, imagine the consequence. If we do not do anything, no? We are not predicting that that event will happen soon, but it might happen and we better prepare for it. And the better way is to really face the reality that it might happen and this will be the consequence if you do not do anything. So you have to estimate the casualty, the injury, the number of buildings that will be damaged, and of course the economic cost that will be entailed if there is such a disaster. And also making sure that our businesses, all sectors of society would be able to understand that scenario. Yung scenario, hindi pang isang tao lang, lahat tayo dapat maintindihan yon, so that we can prepare together. The problem is, if one sector prepares, but then the rest will not, then disaster pa rin yan. Everyone should be involved.
Okay. You know, I heard this when the debate here in Metro Manila was what's going to happen when an earthquake of that magnitude hits the metropolis. And sometimes, you know, some people would say, well, if we have something like that, then post-earthquake, that would be the chance to do some real urban planning.
Well, you know,
napakalungkot naman.
hindi naman dapat ganun because we have the chance to remedy the problem.
You're
Change.
saying we can still remedy
Yes.
things now?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
hindi naman yan talagang hopeless. Let's take a look at the 1990 Luzon earthquake, Bohol earthquake this year, and Negros earthquake. There were more buildings that were left standing than buildings that collapsed. Meaning, not everything will be affected. There will be many buildings that will be left standing. But the enormity of the issue is there are significant buildings, number of buildings that will be affected. We have to make sure that this will not be damaged.
Okay. Now, when we talk about Super Typhoon Yolanda, building back better in Leyte, Samar, and Panay, what should they do? For example, Dr. Perez and Oscar, yung mga coastal communities na yan, are we saying dapat wala ng coastal communities? Paano?
Hindi naman.
Hindi naman. Or pwede bang, hindi, ganito na lang. Kasi, or, sige, may fishing communities. Andun yung mga bangka nila, andun yung port, pero yung mga bahay nila, medyo inland, ganun ba? Paano?
Pwedeng ganun. That decision must again be based on science, no? For example, ito magandang, this is a good opportunity. What happened with the storm surge is because they now have somewhat of a peg of how far the storm surge went. So that's already knowledge on their end. So alam na nila na, hanggang dito pala yung storm surge, we shouldn't build in this area anymore. Or if we have no choice, if we need to build, we must make sure that this structure will withstand the kind of storm surge that will happen in the future.
Yeah.
And also, I'm sure there will be damage assessments after this, no? They will be able to identify now which were what you call the safe zone areas, no? So that areas you could start building evacuation centers. Of course, that evacuation center must withstand, first of all, high velocity winds, and also it must withstand the kind of earthquake that can be generated in that area, if there is any. So, ayun, they could build from there. And there's no question, building back better is a basic tenet of disaster risk reduction.
Oo.
This is a clean slate for them to start rebuilding.
Yeah, but don't we have a problem with what you said? You said, alam naman natin kung hanggang saan yung tubig, no? Kung hanggang saan yung storm surge. Kaso, di ba, umabot hanggang halos buong Tacloban na ata eh.
The
Hindi
solution
ba?
there is monitoring, warning, and evacuation.
Okay. So they can still build in the same places?
Well, there must be proper land use, but hindi naman pwedeng lahat ay hindi na. So kung yung pwedeng tayuan, but still in the lesser vulnerability or susceptibility area, pwedeng tamaan, then they can be warned and evacuated.
Or pwedeng, as I remember, Architect Palafox was saying, houses on stilts, for example. Yes,
There
Dr.
should be
Perez.
some areas under the CLUP or Comprehensive Land Use Plan na no building talaga, no build zones. Pero, siyempre, titignan mo rin na there could be some building or structures, but the code should be very strictly followed, no? Yun, yung
Okay.
mga ganon.
Yeah, when you say code should be very strictly followed, we're talking about enforcement.
Yeah.
The government to
Definitely.
enforce.
Yes.
And people to follow, sabi ni Director Solido. Yes, Oscar.
I would say, hindi pa kasi tapos yung damage assessment. So I'm not really quite sure if the entire Tacloban was indeed affected by the storm surge. And
Well, ang tubig, yung tubig umabot downtown eh.
oh, it was? Because
Oo,
I have...
downtown, di ba? Tama?
Okay.
Yeah.
Because we're trying to figure out whether this particular damage was caused by the wind, for example. So parang where the storm surge ends and where the other damages began. So we do not have that information yet. So maybe if the initial reports are talagang na-wash out, kasi at this point in time, very conflicting yung reports. Eh. Like for example, in UP Tacloban, some were saying that the waters reached 2 meters and then some were saying just ankle high lang. So kung ankle high lang, that would indicate na this particular area was not that greatly affected.
Yeah.
So we don't
Okay.
know yet at this point.
Okay. But definitely, what we're saying here is, hindi pwedeng, we cannot rebuild Tacloban, Palo, or Moc exactly the same before. Hindi pwede.
I mean, it already happened, di ba?
That would be another disaster.
Exactly.
Yeah. Dr. Perez?
Yeah, if you consider also climate change, which are very uncertain, we need to have some kind of transformation. We cannot go back to the original condition before the disaster happened. So we need to transform. If there's a need to move some of the people away from the coastal area, then it must be done. And actually, there are 4 ideal conditions to do. One is the business as usual. Second is retreat. The third is protection. And the fourth is accommodation. So if we want to accommodate, we should build better than before. And if we cannot build better, we need to protect. So they should have some kind of protection. Maybe mangroves, I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, we'll have to take a short break. News.PH will be right back. And when we come back, we'll have questions from our live audience. Be right back. Welcome back to News.PH. I'm Pia Hontiveros. We're talking about disasters or natural hazards and preparedness and disaster imagination, as Director Solidum had said. We'll take questions now from our live audience, students of UP Diliman. We're going to begin with Adam.
Hello po. I'm Adam Ray Agustin and I'm studying European languages. My question's for Dr. Solidum. How could UP Diliman ensure the safety of the students and the infrastructures as well when, in case a strong typhoon like Yolanda or a strong earthquake hits this area?
First thing, that all buildings must be evaluated if these would be earthquake or wind resistant. And then during the passage of the typhoon, you have to be monitoring the typhoon before it would hit the area. Second, if there's a sudden earthquake, you need to know beforehand where to position yourselves in the room, okay? And after the event, either a typhoon or an earthquake, you need to know what to do. In terms of earthquake, UP Diliman is so blessed with so many wide area that you can...
Open spaces.
Yeah, open spaces that you can go and make sure that you stay there before they let you in. They have to inspect the buildings first. In case of typhoons, though, of course, you need to stay inside the good buildings. So I think what you need to do is first assess the integrity of all the buildings. Second, prepare the students and the faculty and the non-faculty employees on what to do before, during, and after either a typhoon or an earthquake.
Wala pa bang assessment ng mga buildings?
Meron
dito
na silang
Meron na.
assessment.
So this building where we are in, is this a safe building?
I
Siguro naman
I would
engineering
assume,
to.
yes, yes.
You're assuming, sir?
Yeah, pag typhoon, so marami nang nadaan ng typhoon
Okay.
ito ng malakas, right?
Oo. Paano kung earthquake?
Well, kasi wala pa yung malakas na lindol na nangyari nung itinayo ito. The last major earthquake coming from the West Valley Fault occurred in 1658.
Aha, okay.
We had earthquake in 1990.
But that was
91,
ma'am,
but
that was so far. That
was
is not
Baguio.
the real
Oo,
scenario.
Northern
You need
Luzon.
the earthquake nearby.
Aha, okay. Biglang nag-isip ako eh.
I think this is strong.
You think this is strong, looks strong. Okay. Next question from Leah.
Hello, Mr. Solidum. My question is, how has the climate change affected the recent natural disasters in our country?
May I refer this to Dr.
Dr. Perez?
So you better answer that.
As assessed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they said that with climate change, the intensity and frequency of extreme events will be increased. And we can see that it's happening all over the world. And one example is Saudi Arabia. They just had floods. So although the attribution, we are not yet certain about the attribution, we have to make some more assessments if Saudi Arabia floods is definitely a climate change related phenomenon.
All right, thank you, Dr. Perez. Our next question is from Chris.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Diatras, third year BS Psychology student. And yung tanong ko po, for anyone who wants to answer, kasi yung psychology, it's more prominent after a natural hazard or a disaster. Na, diba, counseling po or debriefing. So yung tanong ko po, ano yung pwedeng role ng psychology in disaster preparedness po?
I can volunteer to answer. It's very important even in the preparedness stage prior to the disaster. In fact, one of the programs in FIVOX is to really evaluate the perception of people on how they understand the problem and how they react on it. Pagdating sa disaster risk reduction or disaster preparedness, when we give messages or communication like what we do, our real intention is to change the behavior of people. Like, you just say storm surge, or you just say storm surge this height, and then you evacuate. That's what we want them to do, to evacuate if it's really dangerous. And we need psychology to do that, to understand their psyche better.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. Next question, last question from Carla.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Carla from 4th year BA Communication Research from MASCOM. In UP, we've been having relief operations here, Tulong Kabataan, ISCO operations, and even around Metro Manila. Now, my question is, for Tacloban, recovery is two phases, relief operations and rehabilitation. For us, being thousands of miles away from Tacloban, how can we help in the rehabilitation efforts for Tacloban and the cities that were damaged or devastated? For anyone in the panel.
Oscar?
Siguro one is you can, for example, if you have donations, you look for the appropriate government agency that could help you get that donation across. No, for example, one I could think of is DSWD, another is the NDRMC. So you can contact them and ask them how you could send these donations out to those who need them. Sila naman, I'm sure they have a systematized way on how to hand those donations out to the people who most need them. No, I mean the government is getting a lot of flack right now kasi nga the donations are not getting to the proper places. But I was formerly from the OCD, and there is indeed a system in place. So you coordinate with them, let them know what these donations are, and they will send that out to the people who need it most, not just in Tacloban, but whoever is affected in Visayas.
Go ahead, sir.
I'll contribute. Since you're from the university, I would ask you to focus on schools and universities, because we need to evaluate the resilience of our educational system. And in many cases, schools are being used as evacuation centers. And besides, we have so many young people, they have not experienced many disasters yet, but it is good for us to advocate to make sure that our universities, the campuses, even the DepEd schools are really safe, infrastructure-wise and location-wise.
All right. And we have a last question from Christelle.
Good afternoon. I'm Cristela Gameo from the College of Mass Communication. And my question is addressed to anyone. So, knowing that the Philippines is prone to earthquakes, typhoons, and other natural calamities, how do you rate our country's preparedness in terms of its structures and emergency or rescue facilities, and what can we do to improve on it?
I'll try to take a jab on the answer. Let me just talk about earthquakes and use Metro Manila as a concrete example of building resiliency. Okay? Let us say that we are aware and preparing people on how to respond to it during an event, malaki na ang ating inangat. But the reality is, if you talk about earthquake, it's the structural resiliency that will matter whether you have many people killed or injured. So in terms of the residential buildings in Metro Manila, the study that was conducted by JICA, FIVOX, and MMDA stated that around 13% of the residential buildings can be heavily affected by the earthquake, and even the public buildings around 10%. So, depende yan sa metrics mo for preparedness. But for me, malaki ang percentage na prepared, pero meron pa rin hindi prepared. So we need to improve on it.
Dr. Perez or Oscar or Sabite?
I share the same sentiments. Yun nga. Siguro, the preparation, but let me just stress also that preparation must come from us first, no? Kailangan galing muna sa atin. A lot of it is attributed to, let's say, the local government, but us as an individual in our families also, we must contribute to that, no? For example, we must prepare for, if we need to prepare for typhoons, we do so. If we could make it in line with our local community, let's do that as well. Pero preparedness will start way in advance. For example, wherever you live, you already try to look at what the hazards are in your area. Kung bahain ba sa inyo, or kung if you live on a mountainside, kung may landslide, may possibility of landslide, and then plan accordingly from there. No? Now, I'm sure your local government has their own plans. So if you could put that in line with yours, they have whatever evacuation routes that you know of, you share it with them. So you can work as a community during preparedness.
Dr. Perez?
I think education has to have a go here. Kasi our reaction to disasters are deeply rooted, no? Filipinos are divided into risk takers and risk averse. Pero mas marami sa atin risk takers. And,
Ano po yung risk averse?
Takot ka. Ayaw mo.
Takot lang.
You don't want risk. So,
You're in denial.
not in denial. So they take insurance, for example.
Okay.
They do something else, no? But the risk takers, yan yung
Ayun yung in denial.
fatalism yon. Merong fatalist na kung saan sila abutin, kahit saan sila nandun.
Mamamatay din tayo lahat.
Yeah, something like that. So, deeply rooted na in the culture, and makakagamot lang nito ay education. So I think at the younger stage ng buhay natin, kailangan inculcate na kailangan mag-prepare, awareness, and information. Correct information is
and
really
that's
necessary.
That's why we do things like this in schools. Okay, let's do final words now before we end the show. Sabite, Lacson-Paguio of Oxfam.
Okay, for the final words. Okay. I think I would like to take off from the question from
Sige, go ahead.
Cristel, no? The question of why are we prepared, no? And I think it's really good to highlight that the country faces many forms of hazards, no? Marami talaga siyang na problema, and the challenge for and the need for the country to be prepared, no, is really is really high. So yun nga yung na yun na we really need to understand yung sinasabi ni Dr. Solidum kanina, yung imagination. So from the level ng personal level natin, the question would be, am I prepared? Is our community prepared? Is our structures prepared? Yun yung kailangang i-assess natin, no? In order for us to lessen this impact na nasisira yung ating yung ang laki-laki ng cost sa atin, yung social cost and economic cost for us.
Thank you. Thank you, Sabite. Dr. Rosa Perez, final words.
I think preparedness should not only be the job of one person or one agency. Kailangan everyone should participate. No?
Thank you, ma'am. Oscar Lizardo of Project NOAA.
Ayun, I agree with them. No, preparedness must start from you. It must come from everyone. No, and let's not only look at preparedness. Let's also see how we could completely prevent disaster from happening, and that's not impossible. No, how to prevent, mitigate, and ultimately, if it's not possible, prepare for it. So there are ways on how to do that, and let's look for the right information. Let's assess the hazards in our area, and then let's decide from there. Thank you.
And Director Solidum has the final word.
Well, I cannot really add many things from what they said. I totally agree, but I'd like to just use this time to encourage the youth to really be a powerful sector of society. Ang problema sa atin, yung mga matanda-tanda na ngayon, hindi na masyadong na-educate sa hazards and disaster and risk reduction. Pero sa inyong panahon, you have the opportunity of witnessed what happened, and you can still remember the importance of really prepare for it. Don't lose this time, waste this time, not to influence other people. So I'd like you to really perform the rightful action, so that we, and later on you can have a family, to really be proactive on things. Ang kailangan kasi ma-educate natin ang mga bata hanggang matanda, pero kailangan talaga natin mag-focus din sa mga bata.
All right. Thank you so much to our guests tonight, Director Renato Solidum of FIVOX, Oscar Lizardo, Project NOAA, Dr. Rosa Perez, Climate Change Commission Consultant, and Sabite Lacson-Paguio of Oxfam. Maraming salamat. Thank you for being with us tonight. We should prepare. We should, as Director Solidum says, do disaster imagination, and we should build back better. That is the non-negotiable. Thank you for watching News.PH. I'm Pia Hontiveros. See you again next Wednesday. Good night.